Hi, my name is Ewa Cybulska-Bohuszewicz and I would like to invite you to my lecture devoted to Maciej Miechowita's historical work. This lecture is a part of project financed by National Agency for Academics Exchange. When we think of the relations between Poland and Finland, the very first thing which comes to mind is probably the marriage of Catherine Jagiellon and John Vasa, whose union contributed to creating a kind of special bond between these two countries. This bond, however, lasted for about 18 years, corresponding to the period of the Vasa dynasty ruled in Poland. But actually, Polish interest in Nordic countries, although not triggered by any political or dynastic reasons, start much earlier. The earliest Polish chroniclers, dating back about 16th century, already mention some countries of the north. It is these chroniclers which will be the topic of today's lecture, as they provide a lot of interesting material. Authors of those factual or rather historiographic works try to break with the storytelling style typical for Latin chroniclers in the Middle Ages, which include elements of fairy tale. In Latin chroniclers, describing, for example, the deeds or so-called gesta of historical figures, fact were mixed with fiction. Clearly, fictional elements played a very important role and contributed to creating a very special ornament and style of medieval chroniclers, which was sometimes called difficile in Latin. Adding elements of fairy tale allowed for enriching the story and shaping the image of historical characters as someone similar to ancient heroes being able to achieve the impossible. Renaissance chroniclers broke up with this vision of historiography. The priority now was to present history in a realistic way, without fairy tale-like stories of heroic knights. Obviously, when we compare historical and general knowledge included in Renaissance chroniclers with what we know today, the concept of true becomes questionable, as it always constructed in one way or another. This, however, was not intentional. It was the consequence of a very different level of knowledge of the world. Hence, for example, the geocentric vision of the universe, which is still presented in those chroniclers, resulting from the fact that this was considered as true and real at the time. Today, I would like to discuss one of the first works written in Polish, published in 1535, which is actually a translation of a Latin text. Its long and very complicated title, typical for ancient works, can be translated into modern English like the Polish description of a double land called Sarmatia, in Latin, whose inhabitants, called Sarmatians, are always ready and armed, where other parts of Polish history have also been described. Recently translated from Dr. Maciej Miechowita's writings. Let us examine the title and its meaning for a while, as it provides some specific and important information. The content of the work has actually been summarized in the title. The reader learns that it is a Polish description, wypisanie in Polish, which means that the book was written in Polish. Then the double land of Sarmatia is mentioned. Sarmatia was the land inhabited by Sarmatians. Ancient historiographers, such as, for example, Claudius Ptolemy, distinguished two Sarmatians, the Asian and the European one, and Miechowita follows that tradition. The title also includes some information on the inhabitants of those lands, the Sarmatians, always fully armed and ready for battle, of course. In the following part, the translator, Andrzej Glaber, announces that the book contains other places of information on Polish history, and that the text comes from the written work of Dr. Maciej Miechowita. He is referring to the Latin original Tractatus de Duabus Sarmatis, Asiana et Europeana et de Contentis in Eis, published in Krakow in 1517. Printed in Jan Haller's publishing office, the book by Maciej of Miechów, reputed historian, physician and geographer, soon became a kind of sensation across Europe and was indeed very successful. In the following year, a reprint and a German translation of this work were already published in Augsburg, followed by about 20 others reprints and translation into Italian, German, Dutch and Polish, published in many countries. Such incredible success of Miechowita's historical and geographic work on the two Sarmatians stems from the fact that it provides the first accurate description of Eastern Europe in academic literature. While describing the territory, the inhabitants, the nature, the customs, and the political system of the region, the author refuted a number of legends and incredible stories concerning these lands. The work may also be considered as a crucial point in developing the methodology of geographical research, as it emphasized the need for very first-hand experience rather than basing on the existing text and reputed authorities. The Polish translation of Maciej Miechowita's chronicle was reprinted two more times, in 1541 and in 1545. Its numerous editions and the fact that only single incomplete copies of the book are to be found today prove the incredible popularity of this work. The Polish translator Andrzej Glaber came from Kobyłyn in Greater Poland. He was a professor of the Krakow Academy and a canon in St. Anne's Collegiate Church in Krakow. His published works included, among others, Problemata Aristotelis. He was also the linguistic editor of Żołtarz Dawidów, which was a kind of a free translation of the Psalter by Walenty Wróbel, Both Miechowita's Latin work on Sarmatia and its Polish translation by Glaber provide a number of interesting observations on the Nordic lands. Let us underline the fact that those books resemble, in many aspects, the historic, ethnographic and geographic works of the modern era, which makes them even more remarkable. Miechowita's work doesn't include any fantasy description of bizarre sea monsters or extraordinary inhabitants of far lands who are more like strange creatures rather than humans. The same goes for the description of the Nordic country, Finland, Norway and Sweden, which are mentioned in Miechowita's work. We have no knowledge or whether Miechowita himself or maybe his translator Andrzej Glaber had ever visited any of those countries. Let us note, however, that while mentioning the northern lands, both of these authors refer to their personal experience. Let us look at the information on Nordic countries provided in Miechowita's work translated by Glaber. Most interesting facts can be found in the opening letter of Maciej Miechowita. It's a pity that card number 99 describing the geographic location on Finland has been lost. Miechowita's vision of the Nordic lands, refuting the traditionally established idea of Pomponius Mela, Pliny or Herodotus, is already presented in the introductory part of Miechowita's letter. The Polish historiographer compares their narratives to fantasy stories or dreams, which cannot be proven by experience. Dreams may be interpreted here as nonsense, pointless fairy tales, or even foolish words. Had Miechowita actually visited the northern lands, considering that he refers to experience, I mean something which may only be believed? It is hard to say, to be honest, but it seems that this experience was rather something which stemmed from his conversation with eyewitnesses, I think, merchants, emissaries, or even prisoners. The tales must have been quite reliable, as Miechowita seems truly convicted of the veracity of this story. He addresses his reader saying, "This is why, as I want you to be certain of the real fact, I will describe the truth in a concise way." What exactly do we learn about the Nordic lands, and what does this name actually refer to? Miechowita's understanding of this term is broader than the modern one. Apart from countries such as Norway, Finland and Sweden, Miechowita enumerates Karelia, which was once part of Finland, but also parts of today's Russia like Perm and Jura, which both used to be inhabited by Finno-Ugric tribals. It is in Miechowita's work that we find the first description of midnight sun and polar night, so typical for these regions. The chronicler even tries to chronologize them, using the liturgical calendar referring to the cult of the saints. Midnight sun starts on May the 1st, on Saint Philip's Day, and lasts until Saint Jacob's Day, celebrated in July, while polar night, when the sun barely rises above the horizon and it's only up for a short time, already starts in September, according to the author. Miechowita also offers a very precise, accurate description of the weather in Nordic countries, and in doing so, he refers to experience rather than the testimonies of historians, which he considers to be wrong. It turns out that those lands are not eternally icebound and that the weather changes just like in other places of the world, even though there are more snowy and cold days and the winters tend to be very long. Considering that this description is actually quite accurate and for the most part compatible with what we know today, the chronicler's work deserves even more recognition. But Miechowita's refuting of the fairy tales and dreams, so common for older description of those lands, doesn't end there. Let us recall that many historical narratives, including other Renaissance chroniclers created after Miechowita's books was published, still abound in fantastic information on remote places far from our familiar and sensible world. It is enough to read, for example, the Chronicle of the Entire World by Marcin Bielski. Although it may seem very objective compared to other works of this type, it still contains all sorts of completely false information, including tales of strange sea creatures or extraordinary men resembling monsters who supposedly inhabit some parts of Africa or America. We find no such things in Miechowita's chroniclers. On the contrary, the author investigates and fights those legends. Let us hear his own words then. I will read this fragment in the original Old Polish language to give you a grasp of what it sounds like. Takież pisali dawni historycy, jakoby w onych stronach było mnóstwo złota i srebra, które ptacy, gryfowie albo nogowie wykopując chowają a strzegą. To wszystko są plotki, bowiem tam nie słychano o żadnych gryfach, nie masz też złota ani żadnej inszej spirze. Chyba w Szwecji, tam miedź kopają. Wszakoż nigdy nie jest tak dobra jako węgierska albo w Niemczech koło Szwocza. Jeszcze pisali ci to historycy, aby tam rodzili się ludzie, jedno oko w czele mający, albo o 2 głowach, albo o 1 nodze, drudzy ze psią głową, drudzy, co się w wilki przemieniają. To wszystko są plotki, bo inaczej się znajduje z doświadczenia. It could be translated into modern English as something of this sort. Historians have also mentioned that this land abound in gold and silver, dug out, hidden, and guarded by special birds, the griffins. It's all rumors, as no one heard of griffins in those regions, and there is no gold or any other precious metal there except in Sweden. The copper they mine there, however, is not as good as the Hungarian one or the one mined in Germany, in Schwarz region. Historians have also written that men on board there with one eye of the forehead, or two heads, or just one leg, or a dog's head, or they can turn themselves into wolves. Those are all rumors, as experience shows something completely different. Despite his realistic, almost scientific approach, Miechowita's work contains one fragment of completely different nature, describing extraordinary, inexplicable phenomena appearing in Nordic lands. But I will not ignore the real things which happen there and the diabolic temptation observable in those countries. These were mentioned by the astronomer Hali Abenrodoan, and one can read about it in the Conciliator. There is proof that, at the shore of the North Sea, one can hear the calling of evil spirits haunting the travelers, especially at sunset. It happens most often in forest areas, across the mountains, or at the seaside. In Christian countries, in Norway and in Finland, where people make the sign of the cross, those voices suddenly cease and disappear. In those lands, the night before the arrival of the guests, ghosts appear in inns and taverns, and noises of pans and potters can be heard, as if someone was taking them away. But the inhabitants of those regions are so used to it that they do not notice that anymore. They simply know it is the sign of guests arriving. Other devil's tricks include pushing sleeping people off their bed or branches, or taking them out of the house, especially those who are drunk and behave like animals. Moreover, millers and innkeepers residing by the rivers or in the ports are able to sell wind and good weather to sailors, using the witchcraft. Even though all those things really happen, people from the northern lands visiting our regions are ashamed to talk about them, as they are afraid of being laughed out. However, if nature created those things, it is hard to deny them. This is real information on the Nordic lands, based on our own experience, and the one of many trustworthy people. Why does Miechowita, so rational so far, suddenly include this type of information in his work? The content of those stories indicates that he describes some sort of special beliefs, popular and typical only for the northern lands. Both the behavior of those extraordinary scaries, ghosts or devils described by the chronicler, and the places they may be found in, I mean forests, mountains, shores, is most typical for trolls. And it is actually quite likely that this is what Miechowita meant to say. The word troll did not exist in the Polish language in Miechowita's time, and he couldn't have known it, which explains why he used only very general terms for describing the creatures guilty of those tricks. Let us note that the author takes those evil spirits stories very seriously, as a part of the actual knowledge of the inhabitants of the Nordic countries, which, however, is specific For only that I mean Nordic culture. Travelers from Norway or Finland are not willing to share these stories, afraid of being misunderstood and laughed out. Their reluctance may be also interpreted as a kind of protection against evil forces. They are simply afraid of making the trolls angry and thus are not going to reveal their secrets. As this fragment of Miechowita's work provides a rational description of some inexplicable phenomena, the author had to try to make his story as reliable as possible. In order to this, he refers to the testimony of the astronomer Hali Abenrodoan, quite unknown and difficult to identify in our days, and to the work entitled Conciliator, written by Wojciech of Brudzewski in Polish. He was a respected scholar contemporary to Miechowita. In 1494, Brudzewski went to Vilnius, to the court of Alexander, the great prince of Lithuania. As Alexander's secretary, Wojciech was also sent on diplomatic missions. It is quite possible that he had visited near Estonia and Finland. His work, mentioned by Miechowita, the Conciliator, whose original has never been found, was written in Vilnius. As we can see, the description of the two Sarmatians abounds in information on Nordic countries which, considering the reality of the era, may be seen as quite objective. This objectivity and striving to discover the truth and portray the depicted lands in a realistic way make Miechowita's work very special. His book may be worth exploring not only by Polish scholars, but also by researchers from Finland, Sweden, or Norway.